Good morning, everyone. We're coming to you today from Air Force Association National Headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. My name is Ken Goss, and I'm the former AFA Director of Government Relations. Welcome to this celebration of life for our good friend and colleague, John Correll. To begin, I'd like to introduce the Editor-in-Chief of Air Force Magazine, Tobias Naegele. Tobias?
Good morning. People say around here that we stand on the shoulders of giants. General Jimmy Doolittle's picture out in the lobby, Hap Arnold, who was the inspiration for Air Force Magazine, and I would count in that group John Correll. I get to stand on his shoulders. John made Air Force Magazine, in a sense, in his image. He came in and changed it. And he did something that editors rarely succeed at doing, and that is that his model succeeded not through the next editor, not through the next editor after him. But really, I discovered it, and it's the same model that I'm pursuing now. And, you know, like a designer or architect, an editor has a vision and tries to translate that into words and pictures, and to help the staff do the same, and the writers that we bring in. And then we're craftsmen. We shape a little bit of what they do. But John was a master craftsman, and to work on a master craftsman's work is a special privilege. There are writers who bring you a box of Lego blocks, and then you have to rearrange them and make it into something. And there are writers who bring you a fairly well-crafted piece of furniture. And then there are writers who bring you something that is almost perfect, and you have the privilege to just change one word, or add some punctuation, or maybe, if you're lucky, improve the headline. And that's job satisfaction like no other. It's that final turn of the screwdriver, that extra quarter, that turn that makes things tighter and better. And I think John enjoyed that. He enjoyed having that last little tweak. And if he didn't like it, he let you know. But generally, I was fortunate. He did. He complimented it, and it was very satisfying. So right after I got here, you know, John was a complete gentleman. He said I probably had my own ideas of what I wanted to do with the magazine, and he was perfectly ready to fade into the sunset. He'd done this for long enough, and if I didn't need him, that was no problem. And, you know, that was actually a relief, because often I think many of you have probably had the unwelcome mentorship of somebody who used to have your job trying to tell you how you should do it. And that John was nothing like that. In fact, he became really not just a mentor, he became a confidant, and better than that, a friend. So on those mornings when I got to work and he was here using the printer, and he had a little desk back through that door, it was a real joy, because I knew, well, I was going to lose about an hour, but it was going to be an hour well spent, and I'd be the primary beneficiary. And we talked about art, we talked about the Air Force, we talked about editing, we talked about history, we talked about his illness and his hopes and his disappointments, which were not many, to be honest. So anyway, that's friendship. And I miss my friend. So I've gone on too long. I'd like to introduce my boss, President of AFA, General Orville Wright.
Thanks, Tobias, and thanks to all of you for being here and for joining us today. This is that time in the Air Force Association family, and in fact, the Air Force family, where we find that part of that slot, I guess, in busy schedules to do what's really important. Well, let me welcome, first of all, our distinguished visitors, starting with General Monroe Hatch, former Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and Mrs. Hatch. General John Shaud, former Chief of Staff, SHAPE, our AFA President from 95 to 2002. And Beverly, thank you so much for being here. And General Dick Hawley, former Air Combat Command Commander and my ops officer at one time, about 1977, in the F-4 business. And most important, for Gina and John's family, Donna and Lori and Ray, thank you so much that you're here to give us the opportunity to honor John Correll. So let me just take a minute or two from our time together. And I have here a really interesting letter. Very interesting to me, for sure. It's from Jimmy Doolittle, probably about 75 years ago. And he said this from his office at 1603 K Street Northwest. From General Doolittle: Dear fellow Air Force member, I know that all of you have an understanding of the significance of air power in our national scheme of things. That understanding was achieved the hard way. But the easiest way to give voice to your interest in aviation affairs is through Air Force Magazine, now the official journal of the Air Force Association. Its pages are dedicated to you and will reflect your activities, your beliefs, your ideals, your plans, and dreams of air power. Why not take advantage of this opportunity? Join the thousands already in the Air Force Association to keep the AAF, that would be Army Air Force Gang, storehouse of our country's aviation knowledge together. Pretty good words from General Doolittle, but let me offer some very contemporary words from the Department of the Air Force posture statement. As our Acting Secretary of the Air Force, John Roth, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, C.Q. Brown, and our Chief of Space Operations said in front of Congress the last few weeks. The Air and Space Forces unite the Department of the Air Force and are inextricably linked in defense of the crucial high ground, integral to the stability of the global security landscape. Under civilian leadership, the department's nearly 700,000 airmen and guardians provide independent and integrated options to national leaders while defending democracy, an ideal that President Biden said holds the key to freedom, prosperity, peace, and dignity. The Department of the Air Force enhances the peaceful instruments of diplomacy, sustains instruments of deterrence that check the spread of conflict, and ensures credible consequences for aggression. And then the words go on. We, the Department of the Air Force, provide global strike and effects that can hold any target at risk within 24 hours. This is not conceptual or theoretical, it is reality. Global strike requires a unique fusion of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, logistics, access, and speed that only the air and space forces provide at a moment's notice. Our ability to rapidly eliminate threats anywhere in the world is a consequence of our inherent global persistence and reach, and not necessarily dependent upon prepositioning or forward basing. We have been exceptional at this, and until now, we have also been unmatched. Well, John Correll, I think, would say, as we got to know him, now is the time to push it up, push up the throttle. John left us an enduring platform, really, a launch pad, if you will, and a legacy of not just words, but guidance, that we rededicate ourselves, in fact, to what John believed, that we must remain unmatched as the most lethal arm of a more lethal more lethal and capable joint force, and that would be the Department of the Air Force. So John and Gina and your family, thank you. And you will continue to inspire us, again, not just in your words, but in what you believe. And again, thank you all very much for being here and joining with all of us and our Air Force family today.
Thank you, General Wright. Well, some of you have asked, as we've been putting this together for John, just how did John get here? How did this all happen that he came to the Air Force Association? Well, nothing is better, of course, than to share something with you in John's own words, because nobody could quite put things together in the same way that John could. So in 2017, John was to be given a Lifetime Service Award by the Air Force Association. And of course, our editor-in-chief of Air Force Magazine, Adam Hebert, who's sitting here this morning, Adam had the responsibility of doing the staff work for that award. And so John wrote a letter to Adam and described how he came here, because John actually had two lives here. He was first here as a education with industry, or EWI as we call them in the Air Force. And then of course he came on to the professional staff after his retirement. So please listen to his words. Dear Adam, adding to this morning's discussion, my education with industry EWI tour at Air Force Magazine in 1971-1972 led to my coming back when I retired from the Air Force in 1982. But the EWI tour itself was the result of a series of bizarre incidents. In 1970, I was one of two information officers assigned to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. When the DCS personnel, Lieutenant General Robert J. Dixon, yes, that Dixon, fired my boss on Christmas Eve in 1970, the Secretary of the Air Force Office of Information decided to get me out of there. The means was an EWI tour. There had been only one such previous tour for an information officer, and National Geographic, who had had the first EWI tour, did not want to do it again. Thus, they had to find another publication and chose New Orleans, a magazine something like Washingtonian or New York Magazine. They agreed, SAF OI agreed, I was all ready to go. Then Major General Lee Hogan saw a copy of the magazine in which there was a picture of a New Orleans showgirl not wearing a shirt, or not very much of one. Hogan said that none of his boys were going to do that place. We were not going to be involved in a magazine that ran pictures, and said that maybe Arizona Highways would be willing to participate. Hogan's staff, if not Hogan, understood that a year at Arizona Highways was not going to be very useful. So in desperation, they suggested Air Force Magazine instead. That's where I went. That's how it all followed. In his own words. I'd now like to welcome our former Director of Policy and Communications, Dr. Steve Aubin, and Steve is going to talk about the Enola Gay. Steve?
Thank you, Ken. Good morning, everyone. Gina. My first interaction with John took place in 1988 when he asked me to write a freelance article on European defense industry. I recall that he was reasonably satisfied with what I had provided, but told me he had removed my original lead paragraph, saying it read too much like, quote, new journalism. John didn't want anything too cute or impressionistic. He wanted facts and data that illuminated the key points of an article. That was a long time ago. And I suppose today he would welcome any form of journalism, since balanced and factual news seems pretty hard to find. A few years after that first article, I did some consulting work for AFA while at the Center for Defense Journalism. And not long after, John called me about an opening at AFA for the Director of Communications job. Joining AFA back in 1992 began nearly a decade of collaboration with John. His passion for the Air Force, his incredible intellect and skill with the written word, and his willingness to support and guide those around him, not always in a subtle way, set a wonderful example for all of us. He was a force of nature and someone I truly admired. I count him as a mentor whose advice and counsel shaped me throughout my career. After I left AFA, seeing his byline every month in Air Force magazine always provided me a connection to him. And like all of you, I'll miss him, and I think we'll all miss his voice. I was asked to take a few minutes today and reflect on one of John's most memorable campaigns on behalf of our nation's air and space power. This campaign was all about presenting history in context. In the end, John's efforts and words had a profound impact at the national level. The controversy was rooted in the National Air and Space Museum's 1993 plans for an exhibit on the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan, which helped end World War II. Based on calls from veterans and materials that AFA eventually received, it became clear that the museum had no intention of providing the public a balanced view of what was admittedly a grim chapter in our history. At the time, John captured the overall context of the planned exhibit by citing this quotation from the draft script. Quote, "For most Americans, it was a war of vengeance. For most Japanese, it was a war to defend their unique culture against Western imperialism." End quote. This bias appeared in more than one paragraph, and it was painstakingly documented by John as he analyzed the 559-page draft script. After months of media stories, many based on John's analysis and reporting, congressional inquiries, debates among historians, and the involvement of AFA and other veterans groups, the museum's director had to back down and ultimately present a factual display of the Enola Gay. That exhibit at the Air and Space Museum was ultimately seen by millions, and what they saw was history, facts and data in the context of the time, not revisionism or propaganda. For all John's efforts, he received the AFA's Gil Rob Wilson Award in 1995 for the most outstanding contribution in the field of arts and letters. One of the great things about being a prolific writer like John is that your words and contributions live on. John leaves us a tremendous body of work. He provided much analysis, history, and many insights. But among his many, many accomplishments, standing up to a group of revisionist historians bent on misleading new generations was among his finest moments and lasting contributions. Gina, my sincere condolences to you and your family.
Thank you, Steve. John always had a way of co-opting everyone else into his passionate projects. And we were deep into the Enola Gay project as a total staff here. And he comes into my office early one morning and he said, Goss, and when he used my last name instead of my first name, I knew I was about to get a tasking, so I knew that my calendar could be out for the day. He said, I want you to run up to Capitol Hill and get to our friend Senator Benson in the Senate Finance Committee and tell him to redline the budget, the appropriation for the National Air and Space Museum. And so I'm just listening because I knew there's always a part B with John. And he said, and while you're at it, get the director dismissed. So I said, John, I'll run up there on my lunch hour and just and take care of that. And he said, they just might not want to listen to you. So on your way back, just swing by the White House and talk to President Clinton about it. Well, we were eventually able to do all that, but it was certainly not due to my efforts. It was due to a whole combination of our whole team and the Air Force Association membership, lots of volunteers, and so it was a seminal program for us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our former executive director, General Monroe W. Hatch Jr. General Hatch was our executive director from 1990 to 1995. General Hatch.
Thank you for the introduction. And it's a privilege for me, and I may be the oldest person in the room. You're going to have to put up with my voice a little bit because this is pollen time. And when you have pollen, you need to get rid of it. And then when you put your drops in, everything dries up, including your throat. So my timing is not perfect. And I have my water bottle here to help me. So we're going forward. And this is you've heard chapter 1 and 2. This is chapter 3 of Enola Gay. And this is a booklet. It's in our library, and you may take copies. If you just use those words and put it in Google, you'd be surprised at what comes out. There's quite a bit of interest there that we all took part in, and it was my privilege to be there in a 2-year period. And I'm going to speak on just some of the parts that, to me, make a big difference. At the time, Air and Space Museum was downtown. Udvar Hazy was not running. And they proposed a World War II Pacific exhibit using the Enola Gay as a centerpiece to show the horrors of war and atomic weapons. Nothing about Pearl Harbor, nothing about battles in the Pacific, nothing about planning for the invasion of Japan. They sent the Air Force Association a draft script of such an exhibition, and John was the first to step up. He said, "This will not stand." And he was very direct, as he always was. And I said, "Well, what are we going to do about it, John?" And from there, we launched a major effort. He knew that the actual history needed to be preserved. The Air Force Association suggested they start over and give the full history, but they were not particularly interested in our suggestions. So over the course of the next 2 years, with John's writing skills and his knowledge of history, we published comments on the draft scripts and shared them with newspapers and magazines. And Ken Goss and Steve Aubin have a lot to do at this point in the game. We published comments on the draft scripts, shared them with the newspapers and magazines, sent them to congressional leaders, and other veterans groups also joined us. The draft script was over 500 pages, and John reviewed it all and provided appropriate remarks explaining why it did not portray the history accurately. And remember now, this is over some 24 months. Congressional leaders were persuaded and called hearings, and the Secretary of the Smithsonian ultimately stepped in. He obtained the director's resignation and agreed that a new exhibit would show a full history. The resulting exhibit, when completed, was visited by almost 4 million people. 4 million people, John Correll helped to see the history of the Enola Gay in its full context. I recommend that you read the publication. It's available, as I said, in the library. And I recommend that I'll move to the end because you've heard the other part. But my last thoughts for you. We can each learn from John now how important it can be to step up when you're there. Thank you.
Thank you, General Hatch. And we're now going to hear from one of AFA's former elected leaders. And I'd like to welcome Tom Mckee. Tom was our president at AFA from 1998 to 2000 and chairman of the board from 2000 to 2002. Tom, please join us.
Thank you, Ken. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Gina, so nice to see you here with us all and to meet your beautiful family. You all get to hear what we all learned from John and how we interacted with him on a day-to-day basis here at the Air Force Association. About a year ago, I called John and asked him if he was able to go to lunch. I wanted to get General Hatch and myself and John together and kind of reminisce about days gone by. And unfortunately, John said he was in the middle of medical treatment and it'd have to wait. Unfortunately, we never got that lunch, but we always wanted to. John, as all my predecessor speakers have said, was quite a unique individual. It was fun to watch him because some of them had to work for him, and he was very determined in his position to get things right. And you can imagine him trying to work with a bunch of volunteers in the leadership of the Air Force Association who thought we were always right. And John would sometimes get riled up. He was a true patriot, and he had an infinite knowledge of air power. I remember if someone would get him riled up, he would just kind of start to grin a little bit, and you knew he was thinking at 150,000 miles an hour, like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. And it was kind of like going to an intellectual battle against someone who was unarmed. But John would always smile. He had many facts behind him. My predecessor speakers here talked about he always had the facts. It wasn't anything just a political term or something. He knew what he was talking about. He would throw those facts on the table and let them speak for themselves. I asked John when I was chairman of the board to come into the executive committee to help educate some of our Air Force Association volunteer leaders on some of the main issues of air power and space power. He gladly did that. He came into senior leadership advisory group meetings, what we called the SLAG, and tried to explain what some of the issues of the day were to the non-experts in the field. And when they would try to confront him on an issue, John was so professional at telling somebody how their facts were not facts. I remember as General Hatch talked about the Enola Gay, and John, as Steve Aubin and General Hatch were commenting, was so involved in getting that right. General Hatch and John were quite the dynamic duo of the day. I'm not sure who was the maestro and who was the estudiante, but I know they benefited from each other and that they learned along the way. So they were a great team for the Air Force Association. John tried as best he could to stay out of the Air Force Association politics. He did what he knew best. He was editor-in-chief of Air Force Magazine for those 16 years and did a great service to our nation and to the United States Air Force. When a few of us started the Air Force Memorial back in 1990, John was very interested from the get-go on the development, the design, and even the location. And when it became a discussion about location, John was involved. And fortunately, the Air Force Memorial found the right location for not only our Air Force, but for our nation and for all those who have served in our military. And we're very fortunate to have that. As you know, the Air Force Memorial has 3 spires, and those spires mean different things to different people. Some relate to the 3 core values of the United States Air Force. John epitomized those core values. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Now John has soared to glory. And as the inscription on top of the tallest spire says, and touched the face of God. Thank you.
Tom, thank you. Those of us who worked with John for a long time, each developed our own unique working relationship with John. And so it was in the mid-'80s. John and I had both been working here for a while. And shall we say, on some of our initial projects, working together for General Doherty, we were at odds about some things. So we were sitting in what General Wright now uses as his conference room, and where I don't even remember the issue, but the story is now AFA law. I said something John didn't like, and he picked up a stapler and threw it at me. I ducked, it hit the wall, I picked up the stapler and threw it back, and he ducked. From that day on, of course, we became great colleagues and started to grow a wonderful friendship that lasted through the rest of his life. And it's a collegial relationship and a friendship that I treasure very much. But that's how it all started. So John worked very closely with his staff, and he had some favorites. But his most favorite was Juliette, Kelsey, Chagnon. Juliette?
Good morning. I don't know about being the most favorite. More than 2 decades ago, John Correll hired me as an editorial associate at Air Force Magazine, despite the fact that I knew absolutely nothing about the military, let alone the Air Force. I asked him once, a couple of years later, why he did that. And he said that if someone understood basic syntax, and most importantly, if they got itchy when assertions weren't backed up by sources, then they should be able to proofread and edit in a foreign language if they needed to. And he was right. And eventually I learned to speak Air Force. John mentored me and many other young women, many of whom are here today. But that's only part of the story. He didn't just mentor me, he promoted me. John was raised by women pretty much exclusively. And I guess that's why he had such an affinity for and admiration for women. Before diversity and inclusion were catchwords, before anyone could congratulate him on being woke, before anyone even knew what that was, he made sure that I, who had no significant leave accumulated and was pretty broke and couldn't afford not to work, was able to stay home with my newborn daughter for 3 months. He sent me home with a research project, a massive one, boxes and boxes of documents. But he did that before working at home was a thing, so that I could get on my feet as a mom. He didn't talk about his efforts to advance women. He just did it. He did what he could when he could, and he changed the lives of many young women who entered his orbit. When I came back to the office, he ordered me to bring my daughter in. Often. Rory is here today. If a week went by without him seeing her, I heard about it, and he was not pleased. He was harsh, and he was strict, and he was a curmudgeon. And he expected exactly the same thing from me and from my peers, my female peers, as he expected from my male peers. But he silently recognized that I and other young women sometimes had obstacles in our paths that the gentleman didn't. He did what he could, and it was a lot, to enable us to perform competitively on a professional level. He said Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. He knew that. He and I were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. He told me I was raised by a pack of wild hippies, and that's probably true. But that was just meaningless because we had such a goodwill and trust from one other to each other. And he knew, and I knew, that each of us wanted what was best for our families, for our friends, and for our country. We had lively conversations, but it didn't touch our personal affection and respect for one another. John was not a touchy fella. I'm not sure that I ever hugged him. I don't even know if we ever shook hands. But on September 11th, 2001, General Shaud came down to the third floor to the magazine's offices after the plane hit the first tower. And I was in John's office, and I saw, like watching a cartoon, the blood drain from his face. And he spoke with his voice very raw and tight, and he reminded me that Donna worked at the World Trade Center. She was the light of his life. I sat in his office, squeezing his hand across the desk as he dialed his phone with his other hand, trying desperately to reach someone that knew whether Donna was at the office that day. I don't know how long we sat there, hours, minutes, I don't remember. When we got the news that Donna had not been in the office that day, he released my hand and he went back to work. And my hand was white and it was numb. The second time I remember, and maybe the last time I ever had any kind of physical contact with John, was when he found out that Ray was going to be born. We clasped hands that day too. I have never seen him happier in the 20 plus years I knew him. He was so proud of you, Ray. Every conversation I had with John since your birth included an update on what you were doing, what your accomplishments were, how you were, how funny you were. He adored you. John was crazy in love with his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter, and he was unashamed of showing it. He helped me and so many other young women and young men, I'm sure, by showing us what moral fortitude and consistency looks like, unadulterated by fleeting personal interest. I've heard from many people that have said that they would not be the person they are if not for John Correll, and I know I can say that. He was prickly, and he was awkward, and he was kind, and he was utterly moral. I will miss him for the rest of my life.
Juliette, thanks very much. I'd now like to ask Ted to roll a video tribute that we have from Lieutenant General Dave Deptula. Many of you know Dave. He's the Dean of the Mitchell Aerospace Institute. Ted, if you would, please.
Well, first, Gina, Donna, and Ray, I'm honored to be given a few minutes to share my admiration for your husband, father, and grandfather. Seminal events, people, and the everyday churn that yield progress are lost on time unless someone takes time to track them, make sense of them, and record them. John Correll was that person for the United States Air Force. No single individual is more responsible for documenting the Air Force story over the past several decades. John's work is and will continue to define how people understand aerospace power for the foreseeable future. Achieving the ability to have this kind of impact is not something that can be done overnight. It takes years worth of education to even understand many of the complex issues at play, earn the respect of the key decision makers at play, and recognize how best to convey the essence of what happened or is about to happen. John was a master of doing this and reflecting not just the reality, but the intent and aspirations of the great men and women that populate our Air Force. Speaking of people, John's legacy is rooted in them. Those he mentored, provided opportunities to, and empowered. The list is incredibly long, often distinguished, and certainly impactful. It also shows up in places like the Mitchell Institute, the new Mitchell Institute Space Power Advantage and Research Center, and of course, Air Force Magazine. While we miss him on a personal level, his loss will be felt across the entire Air Force family. There is no clear replacement. It will take many people to fill the void of what he accomplished. He made it look easy, but that was far from the case. He was a true master of his craft, not just as a historian, but as an effective advocate for aerospace power, and his legacy will endure. As an example, it was John's engagement in the mid-1990s to stop and then reverse the Smithsonian's plans to display the B-29 Enola Gay in a way that painted the U.S. as a vengeful aggressor in World War II. It was his efforts that rallied veterans groups in Congress to oppose the exhibition. And as a result, the Smithsonian dropped its plan and ultimately presented the aircraft without an editorial message. His example should inspire us all. Now, during my time as a dean of the Mitchell Institute, John periodically and with exacting timeliness gave me encouragement to pursue my efforts in the face of those who would shut the Mitchell Institute down. He gave me encouragement to strongly educate a Congress and an American people increasingly detached from the military, and not to give up advocating for the virtues and values provided by the United States Air Force. For that, I will always be grateful. So John, while we miss your physical presence, your spirit remains. And I believe that I can speak for all gathered here today that we are all committed to making sure that your spirit endures.
And now I'd like to welcome another of our former executive directors, General John Shaud. General Shaud was our executive director from 1995 to 2002. Sir?
Well, good morning, and thank you, Ken. And Gina, we're delighted to have you and the ladies with us this morning as we pay honor to your husband, father, and grandfather. When I get in this room, I'm reminded like most of the executive directors or presidents that are here, we've logged a lot of time in this room, and it is great to see the staff here. Just just to be perfectly frank about it, looking a little older, but here we are, And the discussions that we have were vital in building teamwork and being able to get together. And I think the people that have made that still happen during the influence of this virus deserve a lot of credit. It's just good to have, as General Arnold said, keep the gang together, and this is the gang. And what a wonderful opportunity it is to express our thanks to John and all he gave to this organization and, frankly, to each of us. My remembrance of John, there are many remembrances, and but what I remember very specifically is when we were all working on the Air Force Memorial. It could have hardly gotten more confused. We had managed to irritate the entire Marine Corps. They came here one by one to talk to me. And what really happened is where the place we had to build the memorial was at the end of the Marine Corps Marathon. So they would lose space and Marathon Oiveralis. But like many other things, the way it worked out at the end of the day, it reminded me we were on the Hill and talking to Senator Warner. And toward the end of the conversation, he turned to me and said, "General Shaud, do you have any remarks you'd like to make?" And I said, "Yes, sir. I'm reminded of something General Doherty said very frequently, which was the wing walker's creed. Don't let go of something till you have hold of something else." And Senator Warner smiled at me and nodded. And as we were leaving, going down Capitol steps, what Peter said, "How do you think we did?" And I said, "Sir, I think we're going to be in good shape." And the way it worked out to have that site overlooking the Pentagon just changed forever the projection of the Air Force Memorial. So I'm sitting in the room up here and I get a phone call that Paycock Freed, and Mr. Freed was the architect of the Air Force Memorial. And we had a fundraiser, perhaps in this room, I don't remember exactly, but the name of the fundraiser was Soaring to Glory. And I was sitting here watching this presentation of this Air Force Memorial that was the first one that came from Paycock Freed. And I was sitting next to General Mike Dugan. And Mike turned to me and he said, "John, I like the name of our gathering this evening, Soaring to Glory. But looking at the picture of the memorial that at that time looked more like a moon lander, that ain't it." And so very shortly after that, I got called down to talk to the architects, but everything was very much up in the air. And to my surprise, John said he'd like to chat with me after one of these staff meetings and said, we're all spending a whole lot of time with this memorial. I think I know what we ought to do." I said, "What would that be, John?" And he said, "We get a B-52 and we put it on a pedestal and we bronze it." And I said, "John, that's just a wonderful idea. I'm not sure it'll work out." But there was always that twinkle in his eye, and to come visit with me when he knew I had a lot on my mind with just a quick story like that really raised certainly raised my morale and everybody that was with John working here at AFA. I'll wrap up this idea of John and his contributions here by saying, number one, he fought the good fight. When John had thought through an idea, and the Enola Gay is a perfect illustration that we've talked about here, he would fight for it. There's no doubt about it. And couldn't be swayed. You would lay your objections on the table, he'd lay his, and somebody earlier said he had proved that yours were wrong, and we'd move right on. But at any rate, John fought the good fight, and he finished the race. And what I'm getting at there was we've had just a series, Adam, of wonderful editors-in-chief, and John left his position. He certainly finished the race. Our magazine was just, particularly among the magazines of the military associations and so forth, was a real benchmark. It had a reputation that was very, very strong. And also the staff had the reputation that if it showed up in the magazine when you were doing your reference work and research, you could look at that magazine and it could be trusted. And the final thing, John kept the faith. He had a lot of sway on the Hill, certainly among the media and so forth. But I'll tell you this, one thing that I came to know about John was that he was always faithful to the United States Air Force. He wasn't involved in things that would be self-promoting. And dear John, we God bless you. We all loved working with you, and just a delight to have your family with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. One of the things outside of AFA that John and I shared was a great affection for Robert Frost poetry. And John's favorite was The Road Not Taken, and I'd like to share it with you this morning. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this story with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That was John. In closing today, from all of us to you, Gina, and your family, John Correll, we are so glad we knew you. May you rest in peace, and may your memory be a blessing to all of us. Thank you for being here today. Please stay and visit and have some coffee. Thank you.